The silence before dawn on June 22, 1941 lasted only a few moments. Then, without warning, more than 3 million German soldiers surged across the Soviet border. Thousands of artillery guns erupted at once. Aircraft darkened the sky. Tanks rolled forward in endless columns stretching farther than the eye could see. It was the largest military invasion the world had ever witnessed. Adolf Hitler believed this single strike would destroy the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks. Instead, historians would later point to this very decision as the moment the Third Reich unknowingly signed its own death warrant. The campaign that was supposed to guarantee German victory became the beginning of Germany's slow and unstoppable collapse. One order changed everything. At first, almost nobody imagined the gamble could fail. German forces had crushed Poland in weeks. Denmark surrendered almost immediately. Norway fell. Belgium and the Netherlands collapsed. France, one of Europe's greatest military powers, was defeated in just over a month. Britain stood alone, isolated across the English Channel. Across Europe, Hitler seemed unstoppable. Newspapers around the world described Germany as an unstoppable military machine, while many ordinary Germans believed their leader possessed almost supernatural strategic instincts. Even experienced generals began wondering whether Hitler's bold risks were simply impossible to defeat. But behind that image of absolute confidence was a dangerous illusion. Hitler believed speed alone could overcome any obstacle. He believed ideology mattered more than logistics. He believed his enemies lacked the determination to keep fighting once Germany struck with overwhelming force. Most importantly, he believed the Soviet Union was so weak that one massive campaign would erase it from the map before winter arrived. Those assumptions would become some of the deadliest miscalculations in military history. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Operation Barbarossa wasn't simply another battle of World War II. You'll see how one decision shattered Germany's strategic advantage, united powerful enemies that Hitler never intended to fight at the same time, and transformed what looked like certain victory into inevitable defeat. More surprising still, you'll discover that the freezing Russian winter, often blamed for Germany's failure, was only part of a much larger disaster. The real mistake had already been made long before the first snowflake touched the battlefield. As you listen, ask yourself one question. If you had been standing beside Hitler during those final planning meetings, knowing only what people knew in 1941, would you have approved the invasion? Many brilliant officers did. Others desperately tried to stop it. Their arguments reveal just how close history came to taking a completely different path. By the spring of 1941, Adolf Hitler stood at the height of his power. Nearly every gamble he had taken during the previous years seemed to have paid off. When he marched troops into the Rhineland, Britain and France did nothing. When Germany absorbed Austria, there was little resistance. The annexation of Czechoslovakia further strengthened Germany's industrial base. Then came Poland, which fell in weeks despite Britain and France declaring war. Even then, Germany's enemies expected a long and exhausting conflict. Instead, Hitler shocked the world again. In May 1940, German armored divisions sliced through the Ardennes forest, a region many Allied commanders considered nearly impossible for tanks to cross. French defenses crumbled with astonishing speed. British forces barely escaped through Dunkirk. Within 6 weeks, France surrendered. Europe watched in disbelief. Military experts who had predicted years of trench warfare suddenly found themselves rewriting everything they believed about modern combat. Each victory reinforced Hitler's confidence. Each success convinced him that his instincts were superior even to those of his professional generals. Whenever advisors expressed caution, Hitler could point to another incredible triumph that had proven them wrong. It became increasingly difficult for anyone inside Germany's leadership to challenge his judgment. Success can be intoxicating. In Hitler's case, it became blinding. Yet one nation remained beyond his reach. Britain refused to surrender despite relentless bombing. The Luftwaffe failed to gain complete control of the skies during the Battle of Britain, forcing Germany to postpone any invasion across the English Channel indefinitely. Instead of recognizing this as a warning that Germany's power had limits, Hitler simply shifted his attention eastward. In his mind, defeating the Soviet Union would solve every remaining problem. Britain, he believed, was only holding out because it hoped the Soviet Union or the United States would eventually enter the war. Remove the Soviet Union, and Britain would supposedly have no reason to continue fighting. That belief fit perfectly with Hitler's worldview. For years, he had argued that Germany needed more living space in the East. He saw the fertile lands of Ukraine as essential for Germany's future. He believed the Soviet government was weak, corrupt, and incapable of surviving a determined assault. Nazi propaganda portrayed the Red Army as poorly led and hopelessly inferior to German forces. Even the Soviet Union's embarrassing performance during the Winter War against Finland seemed to confirm Hitler's assumptions. If Finland had resisted Soviet attacks so effectively, surely Germany's powerful army could crush them in a matter of months. What Hitler failed to appreciate was that appearances often hide deeper realities. The Soviet military had indeed struggled, but it was also learning valuable lessons. Its industries were expanding rapidly. Millions of reserves could still be mobilized. Factories were already preparing contingency plans to relocate deeper into Soviet territory if necessary. The country possessed enormous geographic depth unlike anything Germany had previously encountered. Losing one city or even several would not necessarily end the war. Few German planners truly understood what invading a nation spanning 11 time zones would actually demand. Even more dangerous was the simple mathematics of distance. Blitzkrieg had worked brilliantly in Western Europe because campaigns were relatively short. Roads were better. Supply lines remained manageable. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food could reach advancing divisions quickly. The Soviet Union presented a completely different challenge. Every mile east stretched German supply lines farther from their bases. Railways used different gauges than those in Europe, forcing engineers to rebuild tracks as armies advanced. Trucks broke down. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Fuel shortages became increasingly common. Victories on the battlefield meant little if supplies could not keep pace. Some German officers quietly worried about these problems long before the invasion began. They calculated the enormous quantities of ammunition, fuel, food, and replacement equipment that millions of soldiers would require. They warned that the campaign might last longer than Hitler expected. But after years of spectacular victories, caution sounded almost like pessimism. Hitler dismissed many of these concerns, insisting that the Soviet Union would collapse after a few devastating blows. Once its armies were destroyed near the border, he believed organized resistance would simply disappear. It was a remarkable display of confidence, but also a profound misunderstanding of the enemy. Hitler assumed he was fighting another France. In reality, he was preparing to invade a nation willing to sacrifice millions of lives rather than surrender. That difference would shape everything that followed. When the invasion finally began before sunrise on June 22, 1941, the scale was almost impossible to comprehend. Nearly 3 million German troops, supported by hundreds of thousands of soldiers from allied nations, crossed the frontier along a front stretching almost 1,800 miles. Around 3,500 tanks spearheaded the assault. More than 7,000 artillery pieces opened fire. The Luftwaffe launched devastating airstrikes that destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, many before they even had a chance to take off. Entire Soviet formations were caught completely by surprise. Within days, German armored spearheads advanced at breathtaking speed. Massive Soviet armies found themselves surrounded in giant pockets. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners surrendered. German commanders reported victory after victory. Roads became crowded with abandoned Soviet equipment. Captured warehouses overflowed with supplies. Newspapers across Europe celebrated what appeared to be another unstoppable German triumph. To many observers, Hitler's prediction seemed accurate. The Soviet Union looked as though it might collapse before the summer ended. Even some German generals who had privately doubted the invasion began believing that victory might indeed come quickly. After all, the numbers were staggering. Entire Soviet armies vanished from the battlefield within weeks. German casualties, while significant, appeared acceptable compared to the extraordinary gains being achieved. Confidence soared. Yet beneath these remarkable victories, warning signs had already begun to emerge. signs that would soon grow impossible to ignore. Despite the spectacular victories, not every report reaching German headquarters was encouraging. Supply officers began sending increasingly urgent messages. Fuel convoys were falling behind the rapidly advancing tank divisions. Trucks were wearing out far faster than expected on rough Soviet roads. Horses, the forgotten backbone of the German army, were collapsing from exhaustion after pulling artillery and supply wagons across endless miles of dust and mud. Spare parts became scarce. A tank could survive enemy fire only to sit useless on the roadside because one simple mechanical failure couldn't be repaired in time. These problems weren't dramatic enough to make newspaper headlines, but wars are often decided by logistics long before they're decided by bullets. Every mile deeper into Soviet territory made Germany's position stronger on the battlefield, but weaker behind the lines. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, refused to react the way Hitler had predicted. Entire armies were destroyed, yet new formations kept appearing. Cities that German planners expected to surrender instead fought with astonishing determination. Bridges were blown apart before German engineers could capture them. Crops were burned. Fuel depots were destroyed by retreating Soviet troops. Rail yards were left in ruins. It was a scorched earth strategy unlike anything Germany had faced before. Every victory left the invaders with less food, less fuel, and fewer resources than they had expected to capture. Hitler believed he was conquering a rich land that would feed his armies. Instead, he found himself advancing through territory that had been deliberately stripped of everything useful. Then came one of the most controversial decisions of the entire campaign. By late summer 1941, many German commanders believed the road to Moscow was open. The Soviet capital wasn't just another city. It was the heart of the country's railway network, government administration, and communications. Capturing it could shatter Soviet coordination and deliver a devastating psychological blow. Several senior generals argued that Germany should strike immediately before Soviet defenses could recover. Every passing day, they warned, gave the Red Army more time to regroup. But Hitler saw the situation differently. Rather than concentrating all available strength on Moscow, he divided his forces. Powerful armored units heading toward the capital were redirected south toward Ukraine and north toward Leningrad. Hitler insisted that Ukraine's vast grain fields and industrial resources were more valuable than capturing Moscow. He believed eliminating Soviet armies in those regions would guarantee an even greater victory later. From his perspective, it wasn't a delay, it was an improvement to the original plan. The decision sparked intense arguments inside German headquarters. Some generals obeyed without complaint. Others were deeply frustrated. Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's leading tank commanders, strongly favored a direct advance on Moscow. He understood that speed had always been the foundation of Blitzkrieg. Momentum was everything. Every pause gave the enemy a chance to recover. But Hitler had become increasingly convinced that his own judgment outweighed that of his professional military commanders. Years of success had taught him one dangerous lesson. Whenever he ignored expert advice, he seemed to win anyway. Why should this time be different? Ironically, Hitler's diversion produced another impressive victory. German forces surrounded Kiev in one of the largest encirclements in military history. More than 500,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. It was an extraordinary battlefield achievement that appeared to justify Hitler's decision completely. German newspapers celebrated another crushing triumph. Propaganda declared the Red Army was on the verge of total collapse. To millions watching from afar, the invasion still looked unstoppable. Yet success was hiding a growing problem. While German armies fought around Kiev, the calendar kept moving forward. Summer was slipping away. The weeks lost during the southern campaign could never be recovered. When the offensive toward Moscow finally resumed, the weather had begun to change. Autumn rains turned many Soviet roads into thick seas of mud known as the Rasputitsa. Tanks struggled to move. Supply trucks became trapped axle-deep. Horses pulled until they collapsed. Soldiers who had raced across hundreds of miles during the summer now found themselves advancing at walking speed. The delay that seemed insignificant in August became critical by October. Even then, Moscow remained within reach. German reconnaissance units could already sense how close they were. Some soldiers claimed they could see the glow of the capital on the horizon during clear nights. Soviet officials prepared evacuation plans. Government offices packed documents for transport eastward. Foreign diplomats wondered whether the city would fall a